we got 5 minutes actually. So I thought I'd make a brief introduction to what we might talk about, and then ask each of you to introduce yourselves briefly, and then we'll go into some discussion, really starting with what does diversity in the orchard mean to each of the panel members. It might be a good way to start us off and see where the discussion takes us. I'm armed with copies of various books, and Nick will recognise one of them. And of course, we've had yesterday, as Barry Juniper's book on the origin of the apples from the Chen Shan, and we had Andrew Lee speaking yesterday. And going back a bit further, there's Common Ground's work. And somewhere in between, Pete Brown, who's also been on the conference.
Am I allowed to plug mine then?
I'm sure. Yeah, do. Yeah. We'll get a plug in for all the books. I just haven't written mine yet.
We're trying to get a book published at the moment, but the publisher that we approached turned us down. If you've got any suggestions of other people, this was with Chelsea Green Publishing.
You've spoken to Little Toller?
No.
Little Toller, they're a really interesting smaller publishing house worth chatting to.
Okay. Can you introduce me to somebody there?
I haven't spoken to them for about 3 years, so they might not remember me, but I can. Okay. I don't know if my introduction would be any use, I'm afraid.
Okay, no worries.
To be honest, but I certainly think they would. They potentially really interesting books.
We've had a prompt from Albert, so we're still waiting for Tom, who's not with us. So we ought to get on with it.
He's got us something in the message. He says, "I've refreshed the page, but there's no option to join. Any ideas?"
Okay. Albert, I'm sure is listening. We'll ask Albert to help Tom to sort it out. And I can see in the chat that he's trying to do so. So, welcome everybody. My name's James Marsden. I'm going to ask each of our esteemed panel members to introduce themselves in a moment. My background is, as many of you know, I'm a cider and perry maker at Gregg's Pit. But my past life, I was a director in English Nature and then in Natural England. And I helped, in a small way, draft the priority habitat description for traditional orchards. I just think we might reflect briefly on what we've heard, and I sadly couldn't be with you for the entirety of the conference, but yesterday Andrew Lee talked about the wild origins of our vintage fruit. And it's a story that's been told by others and well worth repeating. And so Professor Barry Juniper at Oxford University has written extensively about the journey of the apple, indeed our other fruit, from the Chen Shan. Pete Brown picked it up in his book, The Orchard, and most recently, Nicholas and Ben McDonald picked it up in this book, Orchard, which I'm sure many of us will have read. And we're very pleased to have Nick with us today. Traditional orchards are special for people because they enhance our relationships with particular places and with nature. They, for me, embody what local distinctiveness is all about. And if we think for a moment about our relationship as human beings with place and apply that to orchards, reflect on terroir of particular orchards, the vintage varieties that they contain, their associations with people over many years, sometimes centuries. Our own orchards, for example, predate 1785. How my predecessors have shaped those orchards through their choice of variety, their management regimes. That's what's provided the legacy we have today. They left their mark quite literally in their plantings, their pruning cuts, as we will do for future generations. And then if we think why traditional orchards are special for wildlife, welcome at last with us. Just making a short introduction. Why are they special for wildlife? because essentially of their habitat and species diversity, varying age structure, abundance of standing and dead wood, rot holes and cavities, and most importantly, low intensity management with little or no use of chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, inorganic fertilizers, etc. That's what differentiates them from commercial orchards. I mean, we're not here to diss commercial orchards. I think we're here to talk about difference. So that's the basis of the discussion I hope we'll have, and perhaps we'll touch on some of the science behind that. In some text I provided to the organizer, I referenced two key pieces, the work of the Central Science Laboratory back in 1998 that showed beyond reasonable doubt that unsprayed orchards hold more birds, more species of birds and rarer birds than commercial orchards. Why? Because they hold more bugs. And then Charlotte Selby's PhD research demonstrated that conclusively out of UCL, and she's about to publish a whole stream of papers off the back of that. So that's by way of background to where we might go. So if I can ask perhaps Catherine to start by saying a little bit about where she's coming from, what the Orchard Project is about. Then we'll go to Wade, then Nick, and then Tom.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Kath Rosen, and I run a charity called the Orchard Project. And we work nationally across the UK in cities to plant and look after community orchards, which are all traditional orchards. So they're all completely organic, and we've planted around 500 across the UK. So I've forgotten what the question was, James. What do we do? How is this reflected in our work?
Yeah.
So I think
what does diversity in the orchard mean for you, Kath, and the project?
Yeah, I think for us it's diversity of wildlife, it's diversity of apple varieties or fruit varieties, and it's diversity of people, and it's the kind of the cross section of all of those things which we're really trying to encourage in our work.
Okay, Wade.
Okay, hi, yeah, I'm Wade Muggleton. I'm the secretary of the Marches Apple Network, and I live in the Shropshire Hills, where I've got 130 different varieties that I grow. So diversity, I suppose, to me is that you can grow all these different varieties and see how they perform in different conditions. I fully expect that in 10 years' time, I'll have quite a different mix perhaps to what I've got. My main orchard's 8 years old, but already you can start to see differences in the way the varieties perform. I did the very original training session for the Orchard Project when it started all those years ago. So yeah, and I wrote 2 books, The Apples and Orchards of Worcestershire, so I know a lot about that, and The Worcester Black Pear, which is my other pet subject. So yeah, very interested in how varieties perform in different places. And the fact that, we've lost sight of the fact that all these different characteristics of varieties had a use when there wasn't refrigerated storage in supermarkets. You needed really early varieties, really late keeping varieties, cooking varieties, cider varieties. So I'm really interested in the way that ancient knowledge was something that was a big part of people's lives.
Wade, that's brilliant. We're going to riff off that, I'm sure, because you've just touched on another people dimension, because of course some of those many varieties that you have were very local. Yep. Graftwood couldn't travel very far hundreds of years ago because it didn't last. Nick?
Well, for me, I got into orchards entirely through my work as a naturalist. And Ben introduced me to the orchard that we wrote about. And, I adore learning about all other aspects of orchardology, or whatever the right word is, that encompasses everything around orchards. But I'm, particularly as a naturalist, I think the variety, as we've all touched on, of species that traditional orchards support, because it's so replicative of the wood pasture landscape, which would have once dominated a lot of, the northern hemisphere. The variety of life, the biodiversity, and the bioabundance that you still find in traditional orchards is streaks ahead of almost every other type of habitat that you can go and look at in the British Isles.
So let's just dig a little bit deeper then, because you've given us a snapshot, Nick, of the importance of structure and management in traditional orchards, which I touched on. Wade currently has an orchard 8 years old with lots of varieties. That's one sort of diversity, but you and I are talking about a rather different form of diversity. What is it that makes that structural and habitat diversity so different from a bush orchard, say?
I think particularly including standard trees, having an old orchard that's allowed to mature. You know, again, we're not here to bash the modern orchard, but if you do look at a modern orchard and you look at the way it's espaliered, looking like a grapevine, there is and sprayed, there's very little habitat there for wildlife to choose. Whereas in a traditional, and particularly an older traditional orchard that's been allowed to mature, that has that diversity in age classes of tree, where the trees are cycled, so that, you know, Wade's got a very young 8-year-old orchard that will, you know, be in its infancy from a biodiversity perspective. Once orchards get into their teens and particularly into their decades old, when they have that diversity of deadwood, of nesting habitats, of connectivity between age classes of tree, different ages of tree might be providing pollen and nectar for a wider window. That is when an orchard comes into its own from a biodiversity perspective. You know, once you get, you know, an orchard tree matures incredibly quickly in plant terms. You know, an oak tree can take 200-300 years before it becomes really productive as a tree to the natural environment that it's supporting. An orchard tree can become immensely valuable within 20-30 years. It's already got those gnarled cavities, those patches of standing deadwood, the diversity of mistletoe within its canopy that it can, you know, support other species, the diversity of fungal species that are attacking it and providing all those little tiny niches. And it can do that in you know, natural history years. It does that incredibly quickly, and that is why orchards are so valuable so quickly from a biodiversity perspective.
So Nick, I want to bring Wade in now, because what do you think we can do to help Wade diversify beyond variety to wildlife species? Because just 50 yards away down the home orchard here, I have got a pair of tawny owl with a female sitting on eggs in a vast rot hole in an old apple that's probably 100 years old. Wade can't replicate that today, but there are things that he could do and probably is already doing. So I need to give Wade the chance to say what he is doing. You know, how can Wade enhance the orchard? Wade, do you want to kick off on that?
Okay, well, yeah, I'm sort of quite aware of that. And you hear these conversations where people say that if a developer's allowed to destroy an old orchard, they'll plant 2 new ones. And obviously then you say, well, where does the wildlife live for the next 100 years? But so I've got like a dozen blue tip boxes on sort of fence posts, because the trees aren't big enough, you know, mounted on posts, and they've been used. I've got fake dead trees by knocking a stake in and then lashing a load of branch wood from tree surgery kind of jobs to it to try and create that dead wood, because a lot of things like aerial pollinators need that dead wood habitat. Just not being overly tidy. You know, I have 2 sheep in my orchard, so it's very, very low intensity stocking rate. Leaving the grass long. I've had snipe in the long grass. We got skylarks nest in the grass, and just things like, rather than, you know, I'm absolutely against burning anything. So piles of prunings, piles of logs, and it is amazing what you find. My orchard was an overgrazed sheep paddock 8 years ago, completely billiard table short, and within a couple of years there were frogs and toads in the grass, the kestrel hunts overhead. So it is amazing what will come if you just allow nature to do so.
So what you're signaling, Wade, is low intensity, very low intensive management is already making a difference.
Huge
Tom,
difference. Yeah.
You want to? Are you able to come in and join us now? You're on mute. No is the answer. Kath, any reflections on that?
Yeah, I was just going to talk a bit about pollinators and how even, you know, leaving things like dandelions provide all these early pollen sources for all the, you know, the bees. But what's been really interesting for us is people often ask us, oh, should we have beehives in the orchards to try and increase pollinators? And beehives, honeybees are not good for orchard trees at all because they overwork the blossoms. And in London particularly, there are too many hives. So people are, those honeybees are robbing food from actual, native bumblebees and solitary bees.
I couldn't agree with you more, Catherine. And I have a friend who once wanted to put bees in our orchard, and when I told him I had 2 hornet nests, he quickly had another idea, because of course the hornets eat the bees, as well as the wasps and many other things. The hornets are our top predator in the old orchard, and what do hornets need? Dead wood, lots of it. So how could we help Wade think about, and Wade, sorry, this sounds like a criticism, it's not. To create standing dead wood, I let old trees die and I leave them standing. And when the boughs fall off and become a hazard to my visitors, I create a totem, literally a totem. And then when the cows rub their asses against the standing wood after about 5 years and it falls over, instead of being a vertical larder for woodpeckers while it's still upright, it becomes a different bug store for different things. And eventually the badger will break it down to nothing. So have you thought about importing some dead fruit wood and just leaving it lying or propped up in the orchard?
I haven't, because the village where I live, there isn't really a lot to do that. And I suppose there are biosecurity implications in moving stuff around, but certainly I had a cherry tree was being taken down in the village, and I acquired some branch wood and, as I say, lashed it to a post to make like a vertical dead tree. And so there's things like that you can do, and I think just not being overly and obsessively tidy and about clearing everything away. There's always, well, there used to be this tradition of just hygiene obsession, burn it all, get everything out, get rid of it, tidy up. So wildlife likes a bit of a untidy corner here and there, doesn't it?
So let's bank that. I think we're all nodding. Messy and untidy. We like that. We've touched on deadwood. Let's go up to the top and let's think about the canopy of the orchard and the vertical structure. Who wants to kick off on that?
I can go in terms of its biodiversity value. Again, just looking at it, I look at everything in an orchard from what it does for wildlife, and there are so many different species that canopy structure supports, from your chaffinches to your goldfinches to your mistle thrushes, to your wood pigeons to your collared doves, to your bullfinches. The canopy structure is incredibly important, but also alongside the canopy structure within the orchard itself are the hedgerows. And I think one thing that I've particularly noticed from visiting traditional orchards is that traditional orchard owners really understand the importance of healthy hedgerows, big hedgerows, meters wide, meters high, allowed to fulfill their purpose originally, which was to keep in livestock or provide a boundary. And the benefit that they provide, which is there's so much food and so much shelter provided in a traditional hedgerow. So canopy within the orchard structure and the canopy provided by the hedgerow around it are both of huge wildlife value.
Okay, so we're starting to reflect on different habitat niches within the orchard. We talked about the canopy, we've talked about the deadwood. Nick's just introduced the boundary features. What other habitat features might there be? And Wade talked a little bit about the orchard floor and the management of the grassland. So what other aspects might we reflect on here?
Can I just add something about hedges then? Because my orchard, as I say, was an overgrey sheep paddock, or the corner of a larger overgrey sheep paddock. So the first thing I did was plant a new native mixed species hedge around the sides, which in 8 years I've never had the top trimmed. So it's now about 8 or 9 feet tall. There were birds nesting in it within 3 years. But it sticks out in the local landscape because I don't have it flayed. And I think people think, what's wrong with that? But it's just so full of life. And when you question the way we treat hedges, why do we do it? We flail them to an inch of their lives. And why do we do it? And people say, well, it's because what we've always done, which isn't true because they used to be laid, or they say it looks tidy. But it's just, when you let one go, it's just extraordinary what will live in it. All sorts of birds nest in it. You go up there and there's flocks of yellowhammers working it. There's wrens in and out of it all the time. It's just that we just got to change our mindset about the way we treat hedges. As Nick said, when you've got a really amazing hedge, the life in it, which then does all your predator control in the orchard and eats your eats your pest species. So yeah, hedges.
So we've begun to talk off the back of what Wade has just said about thinking of the orchard, even at a small scale, as a whole ecosystem, and our place as the orchard manager, the beneficiary within it. Say more, Nick, about how you understand that concept of the orchard ecosystem in its totality and what that means from your perspective.
Well, I think you hit a really good point, which is that the whole setup within an orchard is managed. We have a choice as orchard owners and growers to decide how much we wish to let nature in or block it out of that. And one thing that we discovered over the course of writing the book was that the relationship between people and orchards used to be entirely antagonistic. The Elizabethan grain axe right through to the bullfinch clubs killing bullfinches right into the 20th century. It was an antagonistic relationship, a heavily managed relationship between the wildlife that came into an orchard. As the 20th century progressed, that relationship shifted and it became a heavily managed relationship where we were flailing our hedges, heavily mowing the grass under the fauna to managing the flora. And now we're realizing quite how valuable traditional orchards are, because where those two things were left to do their own thing, all of those red list species have thrived. And so, alongside having your big healthy hedges, your traditional and ancient wood left within the orchard, the next one is water, and having a fresh water source is essential for all wildlife. Be it ponds, or if you're lucky, you've got a spring or a stream running through the land. But I'd say that would be the third major component. That if there's not a fresh water source, get a fresh water source in there, dig a pond, clay line it, and that is, if wildlife need three things: they need somewhere to feed, they need somewhere to breed, and they need somewhere to hide. And if you can provide them those three things, they will thrive.
Yeah. So we've got our first question in from the floor, and I'm minded to take these as we go along. So Mary Fielding, who's one of the stalwarts of the Big Apple Association, has submitted a question via Albert, and I'll read it to you. You can see it in chat. Does an orchard have to be actively managed? We have an old apple orchard next to us, which apart from grazing sheep and cattle occasionally is not managed in inverted commas at all. The trees are overgrown with mistletoe and are falling down, great for wildlife, but the trees won't survive much longer, ? Kath, you're nodding. Go for it.
Oh, I think it's a great question because we do quite a lot of work on these heritage orchards, and it's the way you manage them is very different from how you manage very young orchards, but I think they do need managing. So we've had a lot of projects kind of going into these orchards, but sometimes the brambles are as high as the trees. So that's, brambles are great habitat, but there's just, the trees will eventually die. So I think there are sensitive restoration techniques that you can use for older orchards, which you kind of, I personally feel like we do need to do. Otherwise they will be subsumed by everything else around them.
Okay, Wade?
I think it is amazing how quickly an orchard will turn to scrub. All habitats want to become woodland ultimately, don't they? And I use an awful lot of wood chip mulch on my young trees, but it's amazing how many acorns and little hawthorn seedlings just pop up and that's actually why I invested in these two sheep in the end, to kind of, keep the grass and the scrub in check. And I think the mistletoe thing is a very contentious issue because I work in Worcestershire, and a lot of the old orchards in the middle of winter, they look like they're evergreen because there's so much mistletoe in them. And mistletoe has wonderful habitat benefits to a degree, but the weight of it brings down a lot of trees prematurely. Okay. And of course, in the winter, it acts as a sail effect and catches the wind in a way that it wouldn't do if it wasn't there.
I'd like to come back. I'd like to come back specifically to the management of mistletoe in a moment, because you've given us another hook to go off on one. Nick, what about you?
I definitely agree with with Catherine and Wade there. Yes, orchards do need to be managed. If they are left completely to their own devices, they will be encroached by scrub and will still be a valuable habitat, but they won't be an orchard habitat anymore. They'll be a scrubland habitat, and you will get a different class of creatures using it as a result. So I think minimalism, absolutely, and ensuring. I think the principal thing that needs to happen is the regeneration of trees, allowing trees to get to their end of life, leave them as standing deadwood for as long as possible, and at that absolute last minute where they topple over, leave them on the ground as standing deadwood, but make sure that you're then you allowing the succession. Choosing which stock you're going to leave for the next generation.
Yeah, exactly. And Nick, you've not had the benefit of coming or disbenefit, depending on your point of view, of coming to Gregg's pit. I look forward to welcoming you and Ben another time. Ben was due to come here last October, but Big Apple was cancelled, sadly. When I bought my place in 1992, the home orchard looked like a wood. You couldn't see that the rows were in trees. And I went about it and cleared it. And afterwards I thought, oh my God, it's probably less biodiverse now than when I bought it. And that was probably true. But I've interplanted, it's got loads of dead wood, and it's now very biodiverse again. And it will be there long after I'm not. So I think this is all about balance. Even in the near wild conditions, I'm going to tell a brief story. I spend a lot of time in Italy when I can, pre-COVID. In the Abruzzo, in the Apennines, volunteers are now pruning the abandoned orchards high up on the hill so that those abandoned fruit trees can fruit again to feed the indigenous Marsden brown bears. So, there is a rationale always for management, even if that one is perhaps a bit extreme, because I don't think we're going to see them here anytime soon. Let's go to another question from the floor. We've had a question. We mulch our trees yearly with cardboard and willow wood chip, which there are some studies to suggest might reduce scab. I think this is one for Wade.
I think it's a shame we can't get Tom, because he knows a lot about armorial wood chip as well. But
he's looking very frustrated. We sympathise.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of using wood chip generally as a mulch on young trees. And there was always this old chestnut that it strips the nitrogen out of the soil. But there's been some recent research that actually that's not entirely true, and that the amount of mycorrhizal activity that it will generate and the trace elements and things in it is actually phenomenally good. So if you can get tree surgery kind of waste, I'm a big fan of mulching young trees in particular, because that's the one thing that I always bang on about with young trees is it's weed control, weed control, weed control. They do not like the grass growing around the base of them. It will rob the nutrient and the moisture. So you've got to, for the first few years, you've got to keep that weed-free zone around young trees. And the best way to do it is with a wood chip.
Kath, do you have a take on that?
I'm really delighted that someone's mentioned willow wood chip, because it's something we're really interested in, and I think actually there've been lots of trials in commercial orchards which prove there is this beneficial relationship between the kind of the chemicals within the willow, which is this is where we get aspirin from, and antibacterial, it's not antibacterial, but properties within that which will help suppress diseases in the trees. I just think is really fascinating. And willow itself is an amazing habitat, and you can make in terms of community orchards, you can make lots of things from it. But for us, that kind of planting beneficial species near orchards is a big part of our model, and we're moving much more towards a kind of forest gardening type approach where you have edible crops on lots of different layers within that orchard.
Okay, that's great. I'm making a note of some topics that we'll come back to if we've got time for. Panel, just in case we miss them, they are mistletoe, mycorrhiza, fungal relationships, and companion planting. So we may try and come back to those. But in the meantime, I've got another question up from Helen Jones. Our trad chemical-free orchard, 250 standard trees in an old pasture where we weed each tree. trees now old enough, we want to stop weeding. Do you think we just stop and let it all come back, or is it a process? Well, I'd introduce some grazing, frankly, but what do others think?
Okay, so I'll speak from a purely biodiversity perspective, and I have no knowledge of what age you need to keep weeding around trees to stop them dying. But from a biodiversity perspective, having that scrub around the bottom of a tree, particularly nettle, is hugely important in, you know, for a huge number of species that will, particularly ground nesting birds such as chiffchaff, that will use that, and particularly vole species as well in the summer, when, you know, they will be using that as cover. But I'll let someone else advise on it from a tree longevity point of view.
Okay, well, I'll give it a go. At the moment, the grass in the home orchard is about somewhere between 18 inches and 2 feet tall. It would have been taller had we had more rain in April and March. I will be introducing into the small home orchard, which is only 2 acres, couple of cows with calves at foot next week, and they'll be in for about a month, or until they get the grass down to about yay high. And they will distribute the wild daffodil seed beautifully and the cowslip seed beautifully, and they'll then go. And then in July or August maybe, I will have sheep in for no more than 6 weeks. Sheep come out before fruitfall, ideally a month, 6 weeks before fruitfall, to avoid any risk of cross-contamination. So they're out by mid to late August at the latest. So 2 different periods of grazing does the trick. It provides nutrient, it reduces the competition, but others will do it their way. Any views on that?
Well, only that with a young orchard, I didn't have any grass management for the first 3-4 years probably, and it was a pain in the neck trying to keep the grass either cut or scythed or mown, and it was just loads of work, which is in the end why I resorted to my two sheep regime. So my children raised these cade lambs, you know, with a bottle, so they're quite user-friendly sheep because they're quite tame, and they rotate between my orchard and another paddock. So to give rest periods.
So
but
on a slightly different scale, Wade, you're doing something very similar. We're using domestic animals, livestock, as a management tool,
yep,
which is replicating what would happen in a wood pasture in a near a natural situation, which Nick was referring to earlier. We've got another question, one very deep and cultural, from Maria. So I think we'll go there before we come back to management technique. Maria Kennedy, I assume, is in America or even Canada. Do you think there is an aesthetic dimension to the biodiverse management of orchards, in the sense that orchards are dependent on human intervention? Interesting. Aesthetics and our intervention. I mean, I sometimes do things because I've got to look at it, and therefore I'll do it in a particular way rather than another way. What do people think?
I'll just make a comment about soil, and how in a very traditional orchard, which doesn't have any, a very tidy orchard, the soil is often, can be bare, and just that if by feeding the soil and having the soil covered, that we're feeding the tree, and the tree's going to have better apples and better nutrients in the apples. I think Tom put a comment about how trees with things growing underneath them actually have more nutrients in the fruit, and the apples we eat are far better for us. So I just really love this kind of whole if it's about looking after that soil, which that there's this terrible news about how many harvests we've got left because of all the soil erosion, and I think we need to start, we really need to be thinking about that as well.
So it's back to the orchard ecosystem, which probably takes us into some of those other relationships. We'll look at one more question on the chat. Andrew Backensell is worried about rootstock monoculture. Should we be worried about traditional orchards typically are raised from wildings that are grafted, or nowadays grafted onto M25 standard rootstock. Wade, I think this is probably your specialist area rather than anybody else's.
I think that is a really good point about the fact that you've got millions of trees all grown on genetically identical rootstocks. I also have a theory that in the west of England or in our part of the world, there is an issue with M25 because a lot of M25s that have been planted in the last 10 or 15 years end up at funny angles or falling over. And I did see a paper somewhere that said it does very well on the sort of chalky soils of Kent, but maybe on the wet soils of the west, it's not quite as good. A lot of my orchard is on M111 because that supposedly has good anchorage. But yeah, I think seedling rootstocks is obviously an unknown quantity in terms of disease vigor, and you never know what you're going to get. But we probably have lost something due to standardization of rootstocks, because it wasn't done for the little people, it was done for the people who wanted 1,000 trees that all perform in the same way. So if you're an amateur messing about with it, there's nothing wrong with having a dabble with
I've got dozens of seedling rootstocks down the home orchard if anybody wants to come and pop them on.
Well, certainly I know Perry pears as a subject, isn't there? There's lots of I know Jim Chapman, the Perry pear guy from Gloucestershire, and says, that a lot of those they think were just seedlings or seedling rootstocks. And yeah, you get a lot more diversity probably in using them rather than monoculture rootstocks.
Okay. What about the question of mistletoe then? Because Andrew Briggs, if he was with us, and he may be on the conference, I don't know, he would say mistletoe is a really important habitat. The mistletoe bug we all know about, many other bugs, the mistle thrush, other birds, the wintering fieldfares and thrushes are all using mistletoe, amongst other things, in the canopy of the orchard during the winter months. And this winter, just last month and early April, we had bramblings in the home orchard as well, which are amazing. They too were in the canopy and using the orchard floor. So mistletoe is a tricky one. I'll put my hand up. I harvest 30% of the mistletoe in the home orchards. Any single year, I'll knock out 30%. And I'm afraid I burn it. And I burn it because I once took it to the market at Tenbury and I got 40 quid for a trailer load, which didn't cover my diesel. So unless you can get it to market in London or the Southeast, there really is no market. So controversial, but maybe that'll stimulate a response. Kath's looking as if I'm a criminal. I don't think Nick approves. So
in London, it's so expensive. A little thing like this of mistletoe will be about £20. So,
come and get it.
Well, we've been talking to Oxford University. They're about to launch a big mistletoe citizen science project, and they're recruiting for someone to do a PhD on mistletoe in orchards. And yeah, contact me if you're interested to be that person, because they're still looking. But I think it's an absolutely fascinating species, and in London it's a red list species, so we're trying to protect it. I know the rest of the country, people see it and they're like, oh, we've got to get rid of it. But that's interesting, isn't it? How regionally it can vary.
I love it, but ultimately it kills my trees. So if it's on a tree that I want to increase or maintain the yield, rather than on a tree that I'm prepared to let go because it's either past its life or it's done its job for me, if it's done its job, I'll leave it on the trees until it kills it. Nick, what's your take on this?
Mistletoe is certainly of enormous biodiversity value. All of the species you reeled off, as well as providing nesting habitat for a lot of those as well. Mistle thrushes will nest within it, song thrushes will nest within it, blackbirds will nest within it, wrens will nest within it, most of the finch species will form a cup nest within it. So it does provide very important habitat, but it comes back to that point that orchards are a managed environment, and it is entirely up to the orchard owner how much they wish to manage that environment. And like you say, if you're taking out 30% of your mistletoe, you're clearly still leaving a healthy percentage of mistletoe there for those species. I haven't yet seen enough evidence on what happens, if you allow mistletoe to reach its climatic capacity, is there a point at which, you know, there is a balance with the tree, or will it just eventually completely overwhelm the tree? Because I've seen trees with both. Some trees seem to be able to sustain mistletoe attack for, you know, decades really well, and other trees seem to keel over pretty soon. It gets an infestation, and there's probably some research to be done as to why some trees are more susceptible to mistletoe attack than others. But from a biodiversity perspective, particularly for our red list species such as mistle thrush, and particularly for those winter thrushes as well, mistletoe is a hugely important species in the orchard environment.
Yeah, I think we're all agreeing with that. I mean, the trick is how far do you go with the management? I should have said I try and take out 30% of the old stuff and leave a balance of male to female.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm overwhelmed with it, I'll take out some of the stuff in the middle as well. So leaving an age class succession, as well as not just taking out all the old stuff. But you can see when a tree is overwhelmed, because the tree will lack vigor, it won't be fruiting very well, and ultimately it will suffer leaf curl or even leaf fall in droughty conditions, because the mistletoe is just taking all of the nutrient and all the available moisture. So
in the Team Valley in Worcestershire, you can stand on a hilltop in the middle of winter and it looks as if you've got evergreen orchards. Yeah. It's just absolute weed levels. And anecdotally, talking to the older generation, they say it does speed the demise of the trees up considerably. So it's about balance, isn't it? It's going back to that thing about management, some but not too much.
So Catherine, come and harvest our mistletoe. I'm not saying it's for free, but it'll be very cheap. Very
you're making a deal with me, are you?
Absolutely. on live, yeah.
I think another quick thing is to, I've suggested to people just sell it at the gate for the PTA or the fete, or people have just made a few quid for a local cause just by literally selling it at the gate or at a farm shop or something. So it could be a benefit to somebody in terms of making a few quid.
Okay. Moving on then, we touched on the rootstock monoculture, but this idea that actually below the orchard floor, there's quite a lot going on. Again, one of the differences between the traditional orchard and the bush orchards typically have a lifespan of perhaps 25, 50 years tops. They're worked really hard like a dairy cow. And after they've done their bit, they're grubbed out, the ground is ploughed and left fallow. And in terms of management, you might as well be growing a field of wheat. 30 plus spray passes in a year. It's very intensively managed. It's pretty sterile. And therefore the soils are probably not going to be in great shape. Whereas the traditional orchard soils, particularly if it's a long-standing orchard, as I said, ours predates 1785, the home orchard, the soils are going to be more like a woodland. And so I'd like to start with Nick. What do we think we know about the diversity in the orchard soils, from mycorrhiza to fungi to invertebrates?
Almost nothing relative to what we'll know at the end of this century. This is the field which is going to explode in this century. The knowledge that is coming out around mycorrhizal networks is so exciting. And we are scratching the surface on those relationships between what we see topside and what's going on below the soil. I'm reading Merlin Sheldrake's book at the moment.
Brilliant book.
Brilliant book, brilliant cover. I'm listening to an audiobook. It's called Entangled Life. And I hugely recommend that to anyone who's interested in learning more about mycorrhizal relationships between plants, just what's going on in the soil. We've spent so long knowing that soil is important, but now we have the tools to really understand what's going on at a molecular level, at a microorganism level. And again, it comes down to management. We have a habit of micromanaging intensive systems. You can't micromanage microorganisms. They have a whole world is going on below the soil that we don't really yet understand.
So let's just. I'm going to come to Catherine and Wade in a moment, and a particular point for Wade to pick up on will be my neighbour, who I love to bits in an entirely appropriate way. He uses his apple harvester to collect all of the leaves from his orchards in January. And I look and I think, oh, and I know why he's doing it, because he thinks they harbour pests. He thinks that's going to increase his yield by removing them. Whereas to me, that's nutrient. It's building carbon. It's building the soil. So perhaps before I bring Kath in, Wade, from your perspective, pros and cons and how we look after the soil.
I think Nick's right. We're just scratching the surface of it as a subject. The more we earn, and I think Kath alluded to it earlier, but the way that soils can store carbon, they can stabilize, be against flooding, infiltration. The whole thing of soil management is something we've just been completely oblivious to, I think, for far too long. In my day job, I work as a local authority countryside officer, and we're looking at flooding and issues to do with runoff, and the whole soil management thing is a huge subject that we've just got to get to grips with. I think from my young orchard, I'm just going to, keep very low intensity, always keep a good thatch of grass on it, keep the sheep, from ever hammering it too hard, and as we say, just recycle things back through the system, whether it's log piles, leaf fall, fallen fruit, whatever it is. Just let nature get back into it, because soils are damaged everywhere. They're compacted, they haven't got enough life in them, they've been too drenched in chemicals. So we've got to just change our whole attitude to soil management.
Okay, Kath, what do you reckon?
I was just going to pick up on kind of from an urban context, that maybe not particularly around orchard trees, but just leaf litter generally is seen as a litter, and local authorities collect it in plastic bags, and then it's a problem. But we should be using it to rebuild our soils, and it's about kind of having that closed loop system really in the way we live. And I just can't believe it when I see them taking all the leaf litter away. It makes me feel very sad.
With those very silly leaf blowers, yes. I've just come off chairing a meeting of a National Park Authority for 4 hours this morning, when we've been talking about carbon offsets, nutrient trading. There is an investment market developing for these sorts of things. Do we think that there's a place for this for traditional orchards? Could traditional orchards, as a substitute for wood pasture, Nick's point, that delivers all of the benefits we've been discussing, nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, biodiversity recovery, people are prepared to pay for this now. It's an investable commodity as part of putting natural capital stock back to where it needs to be. Is this another way of persuading Joe Farmer not to grub out an old traditional orchard? Discuss.
Absolutely. I think any money, from my opinion, if public money is going to be used for what is deemed a public good, I would be delighted to see it going into preserving traditional orchards. I'd far rather it goes there than, many other places that public money is going that I definitely disagree with in terms of a biodiversity perspective. Yeah. So as a top line, yeah.
This is actually quite big money from people that sit in Mayfair, investor money that's being packaged up. Okay, we've got a related subject from Dave Sanders. And again, I think this is probably one to go to Wade for first. Pomace as mulch, would that be healthy for trees?
I think it could be in small volumes. I think it's very acidic by its nature. I did once mulch a young tree with a large volume from a pressing, and it seemed to damn near kill it. So I think you have to be careful, because it's quite an acidic medium. So you'd probably want to mix it with something else, mix it with farmyard manure or compost or something else. But yeah, it's that idea, isn't it, again, of feeding things back into the soil and recycling.
I think, Wade, your solution is much better than mine, because I feed all of our pomace to our neighbours' cows. And it has a dramatic effect, I'm sure, on the amount of methane that they produce. There's certainly a lot of shitting and squitting and farting that goes on. So I worry about the sustainability of my business as a result of that. But let's move swiftly on. We've got another question about any thoughts of using orchard prunings to make biochar. Now, I know what biochar is, but I've no idea how to make it. Do we have an expert on the panel?
I have seen a demonstration of it. Yeah, it's like you start a very intense fire, and then you basically smother it before it allows it all to burn away. I don't quite understand the science behind that and sort of making ordinary barbecue charcoal, but I'd rather just chip it onto the floor or leave it in a pile for the wildlife personally. But.
I agreed, far simpler. And Kath, you're nodding, so I take it you agree. Yeah. But the principle, however, of thinking about how we can now manage our orchards, not just for biodiversity, but for carbon, for water quality, for flood risk management. These are the big ticket items in terms of public benefits. And traditional orchards have a place in that, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Parts of Worcestershire, certainly around the Vale of Evesham, used to be, if you look at old maps, they were wall-to-wall orchards. And now most of those orchards are cereal fields. And lo and behold, the flooding problem seems to be worse today than it was decades ago. So these things are not unconnected. And there are some extraordinary statistics about infiltration to do with areas with trees on as opposed to areas without trees on. So yeah, I do sort of work on a natural flood management project in my day job, and those kind of things are, yeah, no-brainers really from the way it comes back to soil and the way we treat the land and the whole integrated approach, isn't it? But yeah, definitely.
Okay. I've sort of steered us a little bit around some particular topics. Is there anything that any of the panel, we've got 10 minutes or so left, would like to bring up to bat about? Kath, from your lofty perch in the capital city, is there anything that we rural folk can do to help you?
Oh, I don't think I've got an answer to that one. I just was reading this. Someone's put a very interesting comment in the chat about feeding the pumice to the local rescue boars down the road. That's amazing.
And Nick, I take it, are you down in Bristol at the moment?
Yes, yeah, just back in Bristol. And yeah, I mean, from my perspective, the most interesting thing that I probably would like people to do, if you are an orchard owner, if you are looking to plant an orchard, if you're looking to improve the biodiversity in your orchard, there are a few red list species that do very well in orchards: mistle thrush, tree nesting starling, and particularly lesser spotted woodpecker. This is a lesser spotted woodpecker that I had commissioned. This is how big they are. Just in case you haven't seen one, you may have seen one, but they are tiny and they are doing appallingly across the wider British Isles, or wider United Kingdom, because there aren't any in Ireland. And any records of lesser spotted woodpeckers, there's a network of us who monitor the nests of them. So if you do come across a nest of one in Herefordshire or Gloucestershire, please get in touch with either myself or Ben. Quite easy to find on social media. And there's a group on social media called the Lesser Spot Network who are really trying hard to map where the last strongholds of these lesser spotted woodpeckers are. And they've sort of become a real champion species because they do very well in traditional orchards, particularly where lots of standing deadwood is left for them.
Good. Well, Nick, come and see us because we have them here.
Brilliant. I'd love to. I'll take you up on that.
And I could show you a tree with a lesser spot nesting hole and great spot below it, so Brilliant. You can see the difference in size.
Yeah.
Let's think some more about that. I mean, for me, at the moment, we've got obviously the blackcap back, we've got the chiffchaff back, but I'm waiting for my favourite orchard bird, which is spotted flycatcher. Why? Because in the autumn, just before they leave us and are feeding up, they are tantalizing because they're hoovering up the bugs before I harvest the fruit. And I just love them to bits. So for me, it's the spotted flycatcher is my #1 orchard bird. But I've been reminded in the chat by Sally Webster, and thank you, Sally, that I said we come back to companion planting. Now, I think this is more in Kath's space than any of us, because it's more into the permaculture scene, the urban scene. So, Kath, would you like to start with that in terms of what you do and what your experience is of that concept?
I guess so. We're just trying to encourage all the groups we work with to plant companion plants along with the orchard trees. And it's a bit of a journey, I think, for people to get into forest gardening, because it doesn't look like a traditional orchard. It looks quite a messy system. So that's a kind of a journey to take people on. But we're really investing in it as a charity. We've partnered with the Agroforestry Research Trust, and actually a couple of my members of staff are speaking at a conference they're running next month. So if you're interested in forest gardening, that's the place to go.
So, Catherine, going back to where we started about orchard structure, and we talked a bit about the canopy. So what is it you're planting below the canopy to add those extra layers? You know, if we think of an ancient woodland in really good condition, it'll have oak and ash, and perhaps some elm in the canopy. It'll have hazel and some birch in the understory, and all those woody shrubs as well, perhaps some wild currant, some guelder rose. It's a very diverse environment. So what is it that you're companion planting into your orchards or asking people to do?
Yeah, it's all of those things, but we're also looking at non-native species, and so lots of umbellifers, brilliant for pollinators, and lots of them are edible as well. All the kind of creeping species that you can have around orchards, wild strawberries. You know, it's just trying to design that system where there is edible crops at every level within it. You wanted me to go into specifics, aren't you?
No, I'm not. What you've just described sounds an amazing environment for people to come and enjoy, particularly in the city. And if you can allow them to harvest a bit of fruit, all the better. I mean,
yeah, just that was what I was. Sorry, I was going to finish on. But one of the reasons that we're trying to do that is that we see climate change it's coming, it's stampeding towards us. And by having these more resilient systems for the orchard trees, not only are you providing kind of an extended season of cropping for people to eat, but the plants that you plant will actually help those trees resist, you know, all the things that they're going to suffer in climate change, like planting beneficial species that have different predator insects on them and things like that. So I think it's a really important part of urban orchards, particularly, to make those systems as biodiverse as possible, both for the trees and for people.
Great. Wade, do you have a view on this?
There are, I mean, not so much from the sort of health benefits to the plants, but there are historic examples of sort of intercropping. And in the Vale of Evesham, there was supposedly a system where they grew alleys of currant bushes between the fruit trees. And obviously currants, being a woodland species, are semi-shade tolerant. And then there was the system of some orchards, they used to grow crops of daffodils underneath them, because that gave you a cash crop in sort of February, March, when the fruit crop was obviously at the other end of the year. So there are sort of historic examples of, it's not necessarily a new concept, the idea that orchards are something more than just fruit trees with grass underneath.
And there's, of course, the long-standing relationship between perry pears and cider apples in the orchard. The perry pears planted at 40-metre plus spacing on a grid, and the cider apples and other fruit, damson, plum, cherry, in between the pears. And that's introducing immediately, as the trees mature, greater structural diversity. And of course, in some of those species I just mentioned, the cherry will probably die first, the apples next, and the perry pears a lot of time after. So you've instantly got a succession of deadwood habitat emerging over time.
It's a shame we couldn't get Tom up, because he's done a lot of work on planting flowery pollinator mixes underneath his fruit trees at his place.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Wade or Nick, do you want to introduce anything new in our last few minutes that we haven't touched on?
I'd only just say that I'm slightly cynical about the carbon thing, in terms of, is it just like trying to buy Western lifestyles by saying, here's some money, but we can carry on being polluting and consumptive?
Okay, I'm going to deal with that very, very quickly. Wade, I'm going to send you a podcast by Professor Dieter Helm, who until recently chaired the Natural Capital Committee. The answer is a carbon border tax. So you avoid exporting our guilt about carbon to China by having a border tax on carbon intensity, either in China, if they want to pay it there, or before the product comes into the UK. I'm not a politician, so I can't deliver on that, but that's the answer. Nick?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've heard a number of different. So I thought you earlier were talking about a public funded system, but yeah, I realised you were talking about a private funded system. Where essentially privately offsetting, privately deciding whether or not a business can offset its, which is a whole big debate. So I'd be very interested to see any reports around that, because I think I'm still don't quite understand that market enough to have a valid informed opinion on it. But I would say keep championing, from a biodiversity perspective, keep championing deadwood. Deadwood is the biodiversity engine that fuels your orchard's life.
Absolutely. So hold that pruning saw lightly.
Yeah.
Hold that chainsaw lightly. Yeah. And again, I mean, Wade is more of an expert in this than me, but I never take more than 30% out of a tree, even if it looks like a jungle. I'm always leaving a lot more there than I could take out when I prune. I never prune the mature peri pears. I'm pretty light on the mature cider apples. There's always deadwood in the canopy.
I think you have to ask what you're pruning for, because there is this notion that you have to prune. But at the end of the day, if the trees aren't in production, it's a lot of human endeavour for very little return. And as we've said, deadwood, old trees decay. So unless you really need to do that annual intensive pruning, you've got to ask yourself why you're doing it.
Yeah, I think the answer might be, some would say, biennialism seems to be becoming more frequent, possibly with climate change. I know I could take you to 4 trees planted in the same year, of the same variety, in the same orchard. 2 of them fruit heavily one year, 2 of them fruit heavily the next year. Thank goodness they are alternate, because they're important varieties. But that's what's happening. If I were to prune quite intensively, I might be able to correct that biennialism.
But is it worth it? You've got to ask yourself.
Got it. No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
The final thing I just wanted to add was that this next week, in my opinion, and I'm sure Ben would agree with me, the next 2 weeks is probably the best and most exciting week in the orchard calendar from a biodiversity perspective. If you try and get yourself to a traditional orchard a sunny morning in the next 2 weeks, you'll be surrounded by dawn chatting tawny owls, redstarts, spotted flycatchers. The swallows will be in. It will be fizzing. The dawn chorus is exceptional in a traditional orchard at this time. Yeah.
Never mind the dawn chatting, Nick. The tawny owls are keeping me awake at night.
Yeah.
The male is calling 30 meters away, 50 meters away down the orchard.
They've got hungry chicks.
They have got hungry chicks. So essentially what we're saying is get out there now. You've got the blossom. You've got the bugs. You've got the birds that are eating the bugs. And if you haven't turned the livestock in yet, you're going to have something interesting happening on the orchard floor. And why we don't turn the livestock in until next week, perhaps the week after, is when the umbellifers flower, you get this eruption of bugs that are nectaring on the umbellifers, and then they help us in the canopy of the fruiting trees. So, but you can have too much of a good thing. So if you have too much cow parsley, say, in the sward of your orchard, just bring the cattle in a bit earlier and they'll deal with it and knock it back for a year or 2. And then you can step back and let nature take its course. Great. I think we might be done.
Bang on time.
Any final thoughts, folks?
I think just to agree with Nick, go out and enjoy it. People always ask me what to plant or but if you just walk around your area and see what does well, ask people about varieties that do well in your area. Local knowledge is a big thing.
Yeah, and even just looking at the blossom is so beautiful. Apple blossom. Wow, what a delight of nature.
Good. Well, get out and enjoy your orchards. And many thanks particularly to all of you on the panel. And I feel very sorry that Tom wasn't able to join us, but we wish you well, Tom. And I'm sure you're listening. You're with us in spirit, but we share your frustration about the technology. Many thanks to your time, and do feel free to get in touch and come and visit us anytime. And don't forget to come and collect the mistletoe, Catherine. All right.
Cheers then.
See you guys.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.